What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another edition of Touchline Talk here on a Tuesday. We're sort of in this weird spot now where we're transitioning between the end of the season that was supposed to conclude in May and the beginning of the season that was supposed to be started by now. But that doesn't mean we don't have plenty to talk about. We're going to do all kinds of different things today. We're going to talk about what's happened on the field with Community Shield and Women's Champions League final and such. Transfers, always got to talk about that as well. We got MLS going on. We got an ownership issue in MLS. And I have put together my sort of preseason top 25 for European soccer. So plenty to get to today. As always, kicking it off with our first five. Arsenal just keep winning things. Yeah, we can go back and forth and debate what the Community Shield means. Is it a real trophy? Probably not. I'm not trying to count a treble with a Community Shield in there, even though, Jose Mourinho might want you to. But the reality is, when you're on the field playing a game, you might as well try and win the trophy. And Arsenal is able to do that. And for this team in particular, as they continue to evolve under Mikel Arteta, they got to figure out how to win. This is a good opportunity to get some players who maybe aren't usually in there because, there was no Lacazette. It's a preseason game still at the end of the day. You're not playing for high stakes. You can get some other guys in there. Ainsley Maitland-Niles was fantastic. You've got some things going here if you're Arsenal. You get a great goal from Aubameyang. And at this point, if you take away Robert Lewandowski, is there a better striker in the world? An out-and-out goal scorer? He's in phenomenal form. And they're still working on that contract, but you got to think it gets done. From Liverpool's side, you don't have Trent Alexander-Arnold. They just didn't get Sadio Mane and Mo Salah involved enough in the game. And part of that is because that's part of what Trent Alexander-Arnold does for you, and Nico Williams just is not on the same level. That's not saying anything new. But, you're getting ready to go try and defend your Premier League title here. It just wasn't a great performance. And then, so Arsenal get their goal. They can't hold on to the ball in the second half, and Liverpool starts a flurry of attacks. They finally get a goal through Minamino, who really came on and made a difference in this game, which is good to see from him. And for Liverpool, in terms of what kind of impact can your subs make, that's always been one of the questions with this team, is the depth behind, particularly up front, behind that front three. You know who your starters are, but can you find somebody, and the last couple of seasons it's primarily been Divock Origi. Can you find guys that can come on to and change a game when you're going up against teams with the kind of depth that Manchester City and Chelsea particularly have? You got to find a way to get it done with more than just that front three. And when that front three isn't playing well, like today. And so they get the goal. Arsenal goes through on penalties. It was a good penalty shootout. Really, really well executed for the most part. And the other thing with Liverpool, they got to stop with this high line. Or they got to figure out how to do it correctly. Because this is not Bayern Munich's high line here. And I don't understand what the thought process here is with Klopp. You've got something that's working so well, just don't mess with it. They really had a tough go of it. I'm not concerned. I don't think this is a big deal. Again, they didn't have their preferred 11 out there. Neither team did. It's much more important for Arsenal to win something like this than it is for Liverpool. Klopp comes from a background where these games and this, that sort of cup before the season starts is the kickoff of the season means more in other countries than it does in England. So, of course, Liverpool wanted to win this, but I'm not worried about them. They're going to be fine. It was a good test. I don't put too much stock into this for the same reason from Arsenal's perspective in terms of where I think they're going to end up in the Premier League this season. But again, it's important. You got to just continue to win things and take every opportunity. See what you can get from a guy like Maitland-Niles. Get Aubameyang to continue to play well and continue to be able to lift trophies to incentivize him to stay. You only have so many trophies you can win, and this is in some way, shape, or form one of them. So, good for Arsenal. not the best performance in the world. This game usually isn't, just because it's the first time these guys have played at that kind of intensity in months. A little different this year. The whole feel was different, but nonetheless, Arsenal get another trophy. Speaking of trophies, Lyon's women's team wins all of them. They beat Wolfsburg for their 5th Women's Champions League in a row. That is ridiculous. They have a group of players on this team that have now won 7 Champions Leagues. And we talk about Messi and Ronaldo and the Champions Leagues they've won on the men's side. They have players with 7. It's remarkable. And the fact that none of those players, but your young rising superstar Delphine Casarino, was the best player on the field in this game. Lyon dominated the first half, did everything they wanted to on the right flank, with her and Lucy Bronze coming in behind her at right back, who's, again, one of the best players in the world, easily the best in the world at her position. And so Lee Sommer just kind of reacts faster to the shot to get the first goal. They get another one right before halftime. It looks like this thing's done and dusted. But Wolfsburg find a way. Credit to them. They kept fighting, got a goal back. And then the third goal was very strange. I don't even know. I don't think anybody knew quite what happened. It just got deflected in right place, right time. So Lyon get a 3-1 win. Absolutely deserving. This is the premier team in women's soccer right now. Obviously, when you win 5 Champions Leagues in a row. But this is also one of the most dominant teams in professional sports in the world right now. Especially at the higher profile level when you're talking about the major sports. And yes, I understand it's not the men's side, but I mean, my goodness. They've been the best team in Europe for 5 years in a row. Both in terms of being the best team and, by definition, being the best team by winning the Champions League. It's ridiculous. They're incredible. They are the best team, and they are the best team in the world. I will stand by that. It's an interesting discussion on the women's side, just because you've got this Europe versus NWSL discussion, and the North Carolina Courage have been so good in the NWSL, but I'll still take this OL side. They're remarkable. Congratulations to Lyon on yet another Champions League triumph. Going into returning to the Champions League here. I talked about this when Leeds United came up. That one of the things I was most interested in about this team was not only can they build this thing to stay, because this is Leeds and Leeds should be in the Premier League, but that roster was incomplete. Marcelo Bielsa is getting more out of this team than roster-wise, this was not a great team until he got there, and then he just worked his magic, and all of a sudden they became the best team in the championship. And so you're in the middle of a pandemic. You still have Bielsa and his confidence in his ability to continue to make guys better. But I talked about this, and I'll bring it up again. Your best goal scorers last year were Patrick Bamford, who hasn't done anything of note in the Premier League, and Jack Harrison, who was at NYCFC. And so you're in this really weird position where Leeds are absolutely intending to build this thing to compete with your Big Six, your Leicester, your Wolves, to go into Europe and eventually make a Champions League. This roster is not going to cut it. And so Leeds went out and identified the guys they wanted in the 2 positions that they desperately needed. One of which was a striker, and so they got Rodrigo. This is a 29-year-old Spanish international, Spain's number 9 at the moment. The other player on their radar that I would have loved to see was Ollie Watkins from Brentford. I talked about how much I loved him during the championship playoff. But when Rodrigo agrees to come to your team after talking to Bielsa, you take Rodrigo. And Valencia was kind of in a mess financially, so they could really use the money. And he's been in a system that doesn't, A, is nothing like what he's going to be playing at Leeds, but B, doesn't exactly lend itself to his skill set, I feel like, which also makes this interesting. He's more of a creator than a goal scorer. He's a guy that's going to hold up play, create chances for others, which to me fits really well into what Leeds wants and Leeds does and what Bielsa wants out of his striker. You got to be able to sort of play within this system. You got to be able to combine with people. You got to be able to set your wingers up. And that's kind of what Rodrigo does. So in that sense, this is a really good fit. The other question is, can he press? Can he sort of have the endurance and cope with this system and what Bielsa demands physically? We're not going to know that until he plays for this team and gets integrated into what they're trying to do. But the last time they went and tried to get a striker, it did not work well at all. You've got to be the right kind of player, and you've got to do the things Bielsa asks you. But on paper and from a fit standpoint, to me this makes sense. I really like this move. They had to go splash the money. They had to go get an established striker, because you're gonna have a hard time scoring at the next level, as good as Bielsa is, as good as some of these players are, if you don't have an elite difference maker in your attack. And right now I'm just not sure that they did. But now they do with Rodrigo, and you get Jack Harrison, another year of development, you get him back on loan. I have every belief that that's going to turn into a permanent deal. You've still got your Hernandez's and your other pieces, but that's what they desperately needed, was a big-time goal scorer and just difference maker in the attack, and they got it. The other piece here, though, is that they also got 24-year-old German international Robin Koch from Freiburg. Both him and Rodrigo are with their national teams right now that are going to play in these Nations League games coming up this weekend. These aren't just random guys they found from, the Bundesliga and La Liga. These are guys who are making big-time national teams in Spain and Germany. And we talked about the holes here. Leeds tried to do everything in their power to get Ben White back from Brighton, who was so good for them last season and just a stalwart at center back, and they just couldn't do it. Partially because he was so good, and I think Brighton just wanted to keep him and give him a shot in the Premier League. And so there was this gaping hole at center back. And so you go in and you get a very good player who's making German national teams at the age of 24. Now all of a sudden this looks like a team that can stay up in the Premier League and can really give some teams trouble. I just was not sold on the roster as constructed in the Championship. And who knows, maybe they go make another move. Maybe they go get a winger. Maybe they add some depth at the outside back position. I mean, who knows? But this, again, I'm just fascinated by this dynamic, because they're in this weird spot between your teams that come up and are already bracing themselves to be relegated in case it happens, your Norwiches and teams like that, Huddersfields, etc., and Wolves, who were buying a Premier League team in the Championship with the intention of immediately competing for Europe when they got promoted. They're in between because they're a big enough club that they should be more in Wolves' mindset, but the roster wasn't there yet. And you saw they fell apart at the end of 2 seasons ago and weren't able to get promoted. They finished it. They were good from start to finish this year, but it's just a different level when you get to the Premier League. And if you're Leeds, you cannot afford to waste this opportunity. So they've got their striker in Rodrigo. They got their center back. Now it looks like a complete team again. I really like what they're doing. If these don't work out, it's just because it didn't work out. I don't think this is a failure on the part of Leeds, and particularly Victor Orta, to not identify the right guys. Both of these moves make a lot of sense to me. I really like them. It's just a question of whether they can actually work and implement themselves and get comfortable with Bielsa, because that's the biggest question for any player coming to this team at the end of the day, is can you fit in Bielsa's system? Can you feel comfortable in it and do the things he's asking you? Over in Italy, Weston McKennie all of a sudden went from being linked to Southampton to being a member of Juventus, which is very interesting. And at the end of the day, of course you want your U.S. internationals playing for big clubs, and so you look at this thing now, you've got Gio Reyna at Dortmund. You've got McKennie at Juventus. Pulisic at Chelsea, obviously. And all of a sudden, it's looking really good from Zach Steffen at Manchester City, who theoretically is going to be the backup this year. You know, big time clubs and guys who are getting minutes there. And that's the question with McKennie. This entire move is predicated on whether he gets onto the field consistently or not. Because he's at the point of his career where he needs to play. He's not a teenager who's still growing, who all of a sudden you just look at the idea of playing under Andrea Pirlo as a midfielder and go, well, that makes sense. Even if he doesn't play, he's still going to get to learn. This guy needs minutes. He's ambitious, which I like. He was very open about the fact that he was never planning to stay at Schalke and limit himself to being at a mid-table Bundesliga team. He wanted more. He wanted the Premier League. But when you're weighing Juventus against Sheffield United and Southampton and those kind of teams, you take Juventus all day long, assuming you get to play. That's all this comes down to for me. And that Juventus midfield is not inspiring, so there might be a real chance he does get to play. Who knows what that conversation with Pirlo was like, what kind of hints or promises were made, or expectations were made about the kind of minutes he's going to get. There are spots to be won in that midfield. He's just got to deliver right away, because the last thing you want at this point in your career is to go to one of these big clubs to get buried and then have to find a way to show up for the U.S., especially as you're coming closer to a World Cup and World Cup qualifying, to not have those minutes at the club level, to have to convince Greg Berhalter to pick you into those teams even though you're not playing, and to have to find a way to resurrect your club career because you just can't get on the field at Juventus. It's technically a loan deal, but there's every intention that this is going to become permanent. Schalke sent out a statement thanking him for McKennie for his services. He's not going back to Schalke. This is as close to a permanent deal as you can get without it actually being permanent. So, I like the idea. I will never fault McKennie for betting on himself and making a move like this and believing that he can get into this team and prove that he belongs. It's a big step. And at the end of the day, this move comes down to whether he gets to play or not. Because you can't afford to have these key players in your national team not getting minutes. And, the same thing kind of goes for Zach Steffen at Manchester City. Although they have so many games that he's going to get to play in cups and things like that. And, we'll see if he's there long term. Who knows? But, good for Weston McKennie. This escalated real fast. It was going to a mid-table Premier League team to go into Juventus. And, I think for Pirlo, everybody's spots are kind of up for grabs with the exception of Ronaldo. This team's got to do some things differently and really hit the reset button. McKennie's going to work hard for you. There is no doubt about the effort part of his game. It's the thing I love about him above all else. He just works his butt off on the field. And sometimes you just need a guy like that in your team. And you can argue Juventus midfield doesn't really have one right now. So, we'll see. I'm cautiously optimistic this is going to work really well. To me, it's very similar to Pulisic at Chelsea. I like it if he can get on the field, but you got to be able to get on the field. And Pulisic, blew expectations out of the water and is absolutely going to get on the field for Chelsea. So if McKennie can do not even something similar, but just make that same kind of leap and get those kind of minutes, it doesn't have to be every game, but he's got to play on a regular basis for this to be successful. But, hey, give it a shot. See what happens. If it's a disaster, technically you're not tied to him long term. But he was looking for the next step, and Juventus is certainly the next step for somebody like him. Our fifth and final thing. Yeah, Dell Loy Hansen needs to sell his soccer teams, and he has announced he is going to do so. His soccer teams being Real Salt Lake in MLS, Utah Royals in NWSL, Real Monarchs in USL. They're all together in this group called Utah Soccer Holdings. it was bad enough with the reporting from The Athletic about the racist comments and behavior he's had over the years, and his wife sends some TV station or something a statement saying he doesn't have a racist bone in his body, while not actually denying that any of these things happened that were reported, and you've got a former RSL employee going on record saying these things happened, other sources backing them up. That in itself means you need an ownership change. But now in the aftermath of that, you've got all these other horrific reports coming out about toxic culture inside the club and people being treated horribly. Which, whether Hansen was directly involved in it or not, ultimately falls on him as the owner and leader of that organization. That bottom line. So you have two somewhat independent, related but separate situations here, both of which are deserving of an ownership change by themselves. And thank goodness this isn't going to be tense or controversial. He's going to sell the teams. He has to sell the teams. It's a mess. And you've got to ask not only do you need to get him out of there, but if you're Don Garber, if you're MLS and NWSL, you've still got to investigate this to figure out how it was able to happen in the first place. Both of these different developments that we've had here. You can't tolerate this. You've got to, and not only can you not tolerate this, which goes without saying, you've got to actively fight against this and figure out how it happened and make sure it doesn't happen again. It's just incredibly disappointing, frustrating, appalling, whatever words you want to use. And I'm one of those people that very much believes in the responsibility of leaders and leaders taking ownership of the organizations that they are in charge of and guiding. That even if you are not directly involved, it is still ultimately your responsibility as the one who sets the tone in that organization. Because either, just broadly speaking here for a second, either you were oblivious to this kind of behavior, which means you were not listening to or engaged with your employees, which is a failure in leadership, or you in some way allowed this to happen, which is of course not acceptable either. It's not just about the people specifically involved, and Hansen also has to answer for being directly involved with the racial incidents. But culture comes down to leadership. And so when you see the way that Hansen had been behaving, it's not surprising that this other stuff is coming out too. It's all tied together, and it all comes back to leadership at the top. And so he's got to get out of there. He understands that. And JJ Watt's out here talking about trying to buy this, at least the Utah Royals, maybe the whole thing. I don't know how serious he is about it, but he's going to have a conversation, I think. He didn't just send that tweet out for nothing. So that'd be awesome if JJ Watt got involved. Josie Altidore tweeted, I'll get a group to buy, the players in MLS, in NWSL, and athletes in general were just done with this, and rightfully so. So now the question becomes, who's the new ownership group? Keep your eye on JJ Watt. Obviously, his wife plays in NWSL. He's a supporter of the league, soccer fan. So there's a chance that JJ Watt joins this growing group of high-profile athletes involved in ownership of soccer teams in this country, which would be phenomenal. But it's obviously coming under horrific circumstances. RSL and the Utah soccer teams under Utah Soccer Holdings need to just hit the reset button from start to finish. take complete ownership for all of the awful things that have happened and just do better. Got to do better. Can't tolerate this kind of stuff. All right, that's our first five. We're going to take our first break. When we come back, I will unveil my preseason top 25 teams in the European soccer landscape. You're watching Touchline Talk on 110 Sports. And welcome back to Touchline Talk right here on 110 Sports. So, college basketball, college football, they have these top 25s that come out every week through the AP and coaches poll, and everybody else makes their top 25s too. It's just part of the evaluation landscape, and you got power rankings for your professional leagues in the U.S., your NFL and MLB and such. Just because there's no point in doing a top 25 for a 30 or 32 team league, you might as well just rank them all. So I decided we're going to do the same thing for European soccer, with the idea being that we're going to continue to go back to this at certain points, not every week, not even probably every couple weeks, but every once in a while we'll do an updated top 25. And it's a little tricky now because we're in the middle of this transfer window. But I didn't want to wait till the end of the transfer window because we've got season starting soon, and Ligue 1 has already played a game or two depending on what team you are. And so this is as of rosters right now, based on what I think these teams are going to do this season. So I haven't factored in, for example, a Donny van de Beek at Manchester United because he hasn't been officially announced yet. Certainly sounds like that's going to happen. I'll talk about that when we get to where United fall in these rankings. And this is, again, Lionel Messi's still a Barcelona player, so Messi's considered for Barcelona when I put Barcelona in these rankings. It's just, there's no other easier way to do it at this moment in time. Obviously, if Messi leaves Barcelona are going to fall. But I wanted to give this a shot as we start preparing for these new seasons because we've had some significant transfers that alter some things. And so we're going to give this a shot here. Before I also get into the top 25, the two teams just outside for me are Ajax and Arsenal. I'm just not entirely sold on Arsenal yet. They just announced Gabriel, the center back that they've been going after and were always seemed like going to get. That's a really big deal. They are really, really close. I'm just, they didn't look great in the Europa League last year. They clearly had a awful stretch in the Premier League. I just have some questions still that I want to see this work. But, because I've tricked myself into believing that Arsenal looks good with their transfers on paper, specifically last summer, and it just hasn't turned into results. So I'm still skeptical. They're right on the outside. Ajax just wasn't convincing enough for me last season, and now you're probably losing Van de Beek, which technically is not a factor yet, but you look at the guys that they lost after that Champions League run, and all of a sudden you're looking at a team led by Dusan Tadic and David Neres and Van de Beek. It's just not the same when you don't have De Jong pulling the strings in midfield, Delict on the back line. They squeaked out Eredivisie last year. So I believe in some of their talent, but I would want to see more, want to see them be more convincing domestically, and their Champions League run wasn't anything special either. So those are my two teams right outside the top 25. And here we go through our top 25. 25 is Roma. They finished 5th in Serie A. They were unbeaten in their last 8 in the league. And, the Champions League didn't end great for them. They were slightly disappointing, but that was a pretty good Serie A last year. You've got Edin Dzeko to lead the line, who I still think is underappreciated, underrated. They could easily slip out. I'm not in love with them, but to me they've shown a little bit more consistency, and I'm more sold on them than I am Arsenal at this moment. Although I could very easily see, if Arsenal start the season well, Arsenal would jump them in this. But Roma at 25, 24 is Lyon. And in all honesty, if the Ligue 1 season had played from start to finish, they probably would have finished at least 5th. So pointing out that very poor showing they had is a little bit deceiving, I think. You saw what they did in the Champions League. And Memphis Depay was ridiculously good in their first game of this new 2020-2021 season. They're a very good team. The talent is obviously there. I just think they're somewhere in between the team that didn't perform well domestically last season and the team that made a deep run in the Champions League. They're somewhere in between, which is why I've gotten 24th. 23rd, Bayer Leverkusen out of Germany. They finished 5th in the Bundesliga, but they were, 3 points out of 2nd. All of these teams were right there for most of the season. And again, technically, Kai Havertz still a member of this team, but they're in this ballpark without Havertz. They're just good. They're not going to compete for a Bundesliga title, but they're one of those teams that I would look at and say I could see them getting to a quarterfinals of a Champions League or something like that, which is why they're right next to a Lyon team that did that. 22 is Napoli. They were really disappointing last season, finished 7th. But again, in the Champions League, you saw what they could do. They caused Barcelona some problems. You got Lorenzo Insigne, Dries Mertens. This is a very good team that has been, in that top 3 in Italy consistently. And it just didn't happen for them last season. I expect them to bounce back and to be in that discussion this year. At the very least, in 4th or 5th or something like that. I like them better than Roma. But there are also some other teams that I like even more in Italy. 21, Wolves. I went back and forth on them a little bit because I love this Wolves team. And they absolutely thought that they could win the Europa League, and I concur with that assessment. You get a... It's just Sevilla's tournament. It's tough. But the other factor here is that now they get to focus on the Premier League. You don't have the grueling European schedule where, they were playing for 360 plus days to get that thing going from start to finish. You don't have to worry about any of that. And they're not the deepest team in the world, especially with their top-end talent. They've got their preferred 11, 12, 13 guys, and that's what they're going to roll with. And the other thing that's going to be interesting here, they sell Matt Doherty to Spurs. We're going to talk about him more when we get to Tottenham. But that leaves an opening in that 11, which means you can find a way to fit Raul Jimenez, Diego Jota, and Adama Traore in there. Whether it's Traore playing wingback, whether you switch to a 3-4-3 and put all 3 of them up top. that was kind of the problem they had, is they had three strikers and could only really fit two of them into the system. Or you got a little jumbled because you had Doherty, who's excellent at going forward from his right wing back spot, and Traore with a striker over the top. It was just a little jumbled. So I don't think it's a huge loss not having Doherty, because you can just manipulate the 11 guys you would go with anyway and fit them into the puzzle better. Moving to our top 20 here. 20 is Sevilla. Look, this team is always going to be good as long as Monchi is out there calling the shots and building the squad. They just got Ivan Rakitic back from Barcelona today to replace Ever Banega, theoretically. The ceiling isn't all that high. They are not one of the three best teams in Spain, but they are consistently that team that can go beat Manchester United, Wolves, Inter Milan, etc. They are very, very good every year. They're consistent, and I've made this point before. They were equal with Atletico Madrid in the league last season. I still think they're clearly the fourth team in Spain, but there's a top four in Spain. It's not a top three. It's not, well, there's top two, but then the next cutoff for me is four. And so I'm just never going to, you can never write this team off or doubt their abilities to pull off the upset and to rise to the occasion. They just don't have quite enough to really do damage. 19 is Marseille. They were second in League 1. You've got Dimitri Payet, Florian Thauvin, some nice attacking options. It's just sort of hard to know what to make of them, because part of me almost wanted to put Lyon ahead, but I'm a big believer in domestic performance over a long season and consistency, and that's what Marseille gave you last year. They were clearly the second best team in France, so I've got them at 19. They don't exactly inspire me. I could easily see them dropping out of the top 25 if things don't go well for them at the beginning of this season. But for right now, with what we have to work with, they're 19th. 18, Leicester City. I don't think the beginning of last season was a fluke. No, they're not the second best team in England. But you can't ignore the injuries that they had to deal with. When you put their best 11 players on the field, they are absolutely one of the 20 best teams in Europe. It gets, there's a top 10 or so, and then it gets a little messy in terms of who you're putting where. And so it seems like they're keeping this thing intact, with the exception of Chilwell going to Chelsea. You get Ricardo Pereira back in the near future, and that's the player they really missed, along with James Maddison. That group, I'm still a huge fan of. Sionchu's still there. I love that midfield. Who knows if they go make another big splash in the attack somewhere. But Clutch Iheanacho came into his own last season. This team is good. They're just going to run into some trouble this season because of how many teams have gotten better in the Premier League. 17, Borussia Mönchengladbach. They were 4th in the Bundesliga. They had 7 players with at least 5 goals. This team is really deep. They get production from everywhere. Again, one of those teams that was right there competing with Dortmund and Bayern for most of the season before the restart. They're good. They don't have one star that's going to blow you away, which also helps, because they don't have Kai Havertz that changes the complexion of your team if you lose them. They're just deep and they're good. I like this Mönchengladbach team, so they're 17th. And 16 is Tottenham. I know Tottenham were poor last season, but here's the deal. A, they were really banged up. You didn't get to see much of Kane, Son, and Bergwijn together in the attack. I love that trio. I think Son might be the best player on this team, and I know that's really saying something because Harry Kane is great. That's how highly I rate Son. I really like what they have going forward. You bring Pierre-Emile Højbjerg into the midfield, which they had some problems in. Ndombele was just a disaster. Whether he goes, whether he gets put back in the team, who knows? But you needed some guys who just put the work in and can give you something off a set piece, some creativity. That's Højbjerg. But the bigger deal here, and why I was convinced to put them this high, is Matt Doherty. I love this move. Doherty is one of my favorite players in the world. I just love what he brings going forward. I love how hard he works. He's going to fit Jose Mourinho perfectly, and he fills a glaring hole in this team at right back. I'm assuming they're going to stay with 4 at the back instead of 5, which is going to put him in a little bit different position than he was playing at Wolves. But I'm not concerned about that. Serge Aurier was just mistake prone. Sometimes he gave you a lot going forward, sometimes he didn't. I love this move. I think it's a perfect fit for Spurs. And so now, all of a sudden, you put the midfield together however you want. Put the attack however, whether you want Lucas Moura or Bergwijn or however Mourinho wants to put that and, set his pieces together. But your back 4 now is theoretically Ben Davies, Eric Dyer, who's apparently always wanted to play center back. And he convinced both Mourinho, Pochettino, and Southgate that he's going to play center back now. Davinson Sanchez, Matt Doherty, in front of Hugo Lloris. If this team can stay healthy, I am super, super high on them. And this is Mourinho year 2. You see the progress. It's coming. I really think that they're going to be good this year. Then we'll get to the potential disaster in year 3, but we're not there yet. I love the Doherty deal. It fixes a glaring hole. This team, I love this roster construction. I'm really high on what Spurs can do. So they're 16. 15, Red Bull Leipzig, coming off your Champions League semifinal performance. 3rd in Bundesliga. And, they're still the 3rd best team in the league without Timo Werner, especially if Kai Havertz leaves. They just have pieces that fit what Julian Nagelsmann is trying to do. They're difficult to play against. I like this team. I don't think they're ceiling. They probably caught a little bit of a break getting to the semifinals of the Champions League, but that's their ceiling. But there aren't many teams that can say that they've been to a Champions League semifinal and got there partially without Timo Werner. So I believe in Nagelsmann. I believe in what they're doing. They're going to find a replacement. They're going to be fine. 14 is Lazio. They're somewhere between their terrific start to the season and their really poor finish. They ended up 4th on goal differential in Serie A. They're not quite at the same level as these other 3 teams, in my opinion. I think it was that the run that they made to challenge Juve was not indicative of who they really are, but you can't ignore the talent that's on this team. They're very good. I'm really curious about Serie A this year. I like the depth of this league at the top, from Roma going on up to these teams that we've been talking about. And another one coming in 13th in Atalanta. 3rd in Serie A. I believe in this project. I think they're the real deal. You saw it both in the Champions League after they recovered from that awful start they had, and in Serie A where they were just rolling through people scoring, 100 goals. It's not a joke. It's not a fluke. And it's not relying on any one player. And if it is one player, it's Ilicic, and Ilicic is still there. They're just really good. Now they've got confidence. They're going to be hungry after coming so close to knocking off PSG. To me, they are absolutely the real deal, and I expect them to be right there competing for a Serie A title again this season. 12, Atletico Madrid. Again, 3rd in La Liga. I expect them to be even better this season. I expect João Felix to really take off. He just didn't quite get into his rhythm last year, but you saw in the Champions League just how much of a difference he can make. I don't think that signing was a bad one, or he's going to prove to be a flop. He just had a rough first season. It happens. I'm not overly concerned. I'm not going to doubt Diego Simeone. They're just not fun to play against. They're fundamentally sound. And now you're another year removed from Griezmann, so you've been able to adjust to not having him. To me, they're right on that echelon of tier 2 where in a weird world you could see them winning a Champions League, but I'm just not quite sure they're a legitimate contender to be the best team in Europe at this moment in time. I put Barcelona at 11. Messi's there for now. There's going to be so much overhaul that I don't even know what to do with this team at this point. But I'm not moving them until Messi actually moves. Theoretically, got a healthy Ousmane Dembele. Antoine Griezmann should come into his own if Messi does leave. The talent cupboard isn't bare as they start to move some of these older players on. They're just not at the same level as some of these other teams. So I've got Barcelona at 11 for now. By even in the next week, that could significantly change if Messi leaves, and depending on what they get back. If City gives them players like that one report that it was Bernardo Silva and Gabriel Jesus, all of a sudden we're talking about a team that looks much different. So there's a lot to be determined on who knows where to put him right now, but I've got him at 11 because Messi's still there. Then we get into our top 10. 10 is Borussia Dortmund. I absolutely think this team is capable of winning a Champions League. You've got Haaland and Sancho. Meunier replaces Hakimi. Jude Bellingham comes in. Gio Reyna's looked really good in the preseason. They're just doing their thing, developing young talent. They were good again last season, just not quite good enough to really challenge Bayern at the end of the day. 9, Juventus. Again, I talked about this with McKennie. Not in love with that midfield. You got questions about Pirlo, but you still have Ronaldo, you still have Dybala. You still have a team that was good last season. They just weren't quite as good as they should have been. 8, I'm going Manchester United. You get a full season of Bruno Fernandes. Still not in love with that defense. That could change. Apparently they're going after my guy Upamecano. If they get him, that changes the discussion here. But that's just reports at this moment in time. Dean Henderson, if he can solidify himself as the goalkeeper, or De Gea returns to good form. This team, I really like this team. I'm just not quite sold on them as opposed to some of these teams coming up. 7, Inter Milan. Antonio Conte got his contract stuff figured out. That front two is really good. They're ridiculously deep with bringing Christian Eriksen and Alexis Sanchez off the bench. And for the first time in what feels like forever, Serie A is wide open. There's a reason that a lot of people are picking them to win. I don't put too much stock into one loss to to Sevilla in the Europa League final. I think they're going to gear up and get ready to go again. 6 is Chelsea. I talked about this with the Chilwell deal. I believe in what they're doing. That filled a massive, massive hole for them. You bring in Werner. You bring in Ziyech. You combine that with the emergence of Pulisic. Theoretically a healthy N'Golo Kante. Your question is still center back. You bring in Thiago Silva, which should help with that. I'm not sure if that's quite enough, but it's enough for me to put them in this upper echelon of teams and over the teams with question marks like Juventus and even an Inter Milan where you're just not sure exactly how high their ceiling is. Chelsea, to me, can win a Champions League, especially if they find another center back out there somewhere or, but now they can play in their 4-3-3, and that's the most important thing. You're not relying on 3 center backs. Thiago Silva's going to help organize some things. Really like what they've done in this transfer window. And now we're into our top 5. 5, I'm going Real Madrid. The more time that Zinedine Zidane has with this team, the better they're going to be. They looked really good at the end of last season. They're not going to have too much competition domestically, I don't think, unless Barcelona turns this around real fast or convinces Messi to stay and brings reinforcements. They're just not quite, I want to see this Chelsea team on the field before I say they can compete with Manchester City and Liverpool. Real Madrid cannot compete with Manchester City and Liverpool at this moment in time, which is why I've got them 5. I think there's a clear cutoff between Real Madrid at 5 and PSG at 4. That, I'm buying the run to the Champions League final. I absolutely think they can do it again. Who knows what kind of pieces they're going to bring in. You got to find a center back, as we talked about with Thiago Silva now officially gone. But that front three is still there. Neymar and Mbappe are still there. That midfield made some significant strides last year. They're the real deal, and I don't have as many questions about them as I do these other teams. And they can match just about anybody on talent. So I've got them at 4. Manchester City at 3. They've got to prove that the poor Premier League showing last year, where they didn't even put up a fight against Liverpool, and another catastrophe, maybe that's a little bit too harsh of a word, in the Champions League, aren't a trend. They got to be able to bounce back from this. I think they can. I'm sold that they're going to be better this year. You've got Nathan Ake now for cover at center back. Whether Koulibaly comes or not, you feel much better about an Ake-Laporte pairing, where you don't have to be relying on Otamendi or Stones, because they've had so many problems there. They don't need to bolster their team with the exception of center back. They just kind of need a fresh start, and that's what they've gotten. And of course, this discussion changes considerably if Lionel Messi joins this team. But again, we're not operating in that world. He is not a Manchester City player as of this, right as we're talking right now. So that's why Liverpool is 2 for me. They're the defending Premier League champions, but they looked human at the end of the season. There was part of me that wanted to put them 1 just based on the idea that they won a Champions League and then dominated the Premier League, and then lost in a weird game to Atletico Madrid in the Champions League. But they just didn't finish strong enough, and again, you saw a poor performance in the Community Shield. I'm not saying they're in trouble. They're going to compete for a Premier League title again. But I would not be shocked if they take a step back this season. A step back could mean still winning the Premier League by 3, 4, 5 points. But they have reached the stage where I believe they are human. And when Bayern does what Bayern did to end the season, they're going to be number 1. It's just the reality of the situation. They won the Champions League. They're the best team in Europe right now. And you're going right into next season, which is another benefit they have. They don't have a long time off. They get to keep their sharpness and their form and their confidence. And you bring in Leroy Sané. I didn't put too much weight on Liverpool losing in the Champions League. I was still very much of the opinion that you can make an argument they're the best team in the world. But after what has happened and what Bayern has done, there's no other team to put number 1. It's Bayern. So that's our top 25. Hopefully we'll be able to come back to that at a later time. I just enjoy doing this, and it's something a little different that I don't think many people have done. So there's your top 25 for European soccer. We're going to take another quick break. When we come back, a quicker version of what's next featuring Major League Soccer. Welcome back to Touchline Talk. As promised, real quick here, what's next? One game to talk about today. You've got Toronto playing Montreal for what feels like the 100th time. This whole Canada-US split thing is weird, but it's allowing Toronto to move to the top of the Eastern Conference with 5 wins and 3 draws because they just keep beating Vancouver and Montreal. Impact are clinging to a playoff spot. Maybe they can get some points here, but the bigger thing I want to talk about is that Toronto is playing really well and just feeding off of these other Canadian teams at this moment in time. Then Wednesday, we got some interesting matchups. Inter Miami and Atlanta are both coming off losses. Miami to Nashville, Atlanta to Orlando. When these teams played, they're both looking to get some momentum going. They're both really struggling. Miami could use some... You got to string wins together if you're into Miami at this point. They just haven't been able to. They're not as bad as their record suggests, but if you're going to sneak into the playoffs, you got to get something going now. Atlanta's just kind of hanging around. It's not a catastrophe yet, but they're just not the same team without Joseph Martinez. They got to get their manager in there. The game of the day is Columbus and Philly. This is just, one of your better matchups. It's 2 versus 3 in the Eastern Conference because Toronto has surged ahead with Columbus's draw against Cincinnati. The Union destroyed DC. These are 2 of your best 3 teams in the Eastern Conference along with Toronto. These standings don't lie. Columbus has been excellent. Philly's been really, really good. They struggled at the beginning of the season and played 2 road games, one of them against LAFC, and since then have been phenomenal. That's I don't want to say your highest profile game, but that is the most important, most interesting premier matchup of the day. LAFC, it's got to go play San Jose. No Carlos Vela or Edward Atuesta at the moment against Seattle. It was not pretty. LAFC is 7th in the West and 8th on points per game. The other team that jumps them is San Jose, who is right behind them in the standings, which makes this game even more important. This is the most significant game of the day. They are clinging to a playoff spot, which is just incredible to think about with how good they looked a month ago. But that's what happens when you lose Edward Atuesta, and it doesn't help that Vela's done for a prolonged period of time too. But they are just not helping themselves defensively. They are making mistakes. And Seattle basically, again, learned the same lesson. Don't try and play with these guys. Make them play your game, and they're just not able to at the moment. This has got to get turned around quicker. They're going to be in some trouble just by facing tougher matchups, and you probably have the benefit of not having to have fans there, but this team is about rhythm and should be the best team in this league in the regular season. They have struggled mightily. They got to stop this skid. They got to get things back together. And then finally, Real Salt Lake, LA Galaxy. RSL got goals in the 90th from Giuseppe Rossi, of all people, and 94th from Sam Johnson to draw Portland 4-4. The Galaxy picked up another win. All of a sudden, they look like the better team in their city, which is just remarkable. Give them credit. They're rolling. They're feeling good. I said it after the LAFC game. They can absolutely find a way to sneak into the playoffs. RSL is dealing with a lot off the field, obviously, at this moment in time. Those are not all your matchups on Wednesday, but those are the ones I wanted to highlight. I'm really excited about Columbus Philly. I think LAFC San Jose is fascinating. And also, for the LAFC San Jose game, it's not a good matchup for San Jose because they want to run around, they want to press you. They are not a team that sits back and plays defense. So that could play into LAFC's hands and get them on the right track again. Coming up in exactly 1 hour right here on 110 Sports Live is Chris Brown with Around the Bases, Major League Baseball trade deadline reaction. Tomorrow, Josh Molnick's with his show at 11 a.m. Eastern. That's all we have for you today on Touchline Talk. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you Thursday.